In 1784, Thomas Jefferson brought a 19-year-old enslaved man to Paris, not as a guest, as property. That man, James Hemings, mastered French cuisine, learned fluent French, and created dishes Jefferson served at state dinners for decades. Jefferson took the credit. Hemings died at 36, forgotten. But the dish he brought to American tables, macaroni and cheese, became the most beloved side dish in this country. And that is just number 1 on this list. Number 15 was created from parts of the pig plantation owners threw on the ground. Scientists now say it contains more collagen than any supplement on the market. Collagen. Number 8 started as a way to stretch a handful of rice into a meal for 12. These 25 recipes were born in the worst conditions imaginable. Before we start, hit that subscribe button. Let us count them down. Number 25, crackling bread. When hog killing time came on the plantation, usually late November when the air turned cold enough to keep the meat from spoiling, enslaved cooks collected every scrap. The skin was rendered into lard, and the crispy bits left behind, called cracklings, became the secret weapon of cornbread that no modern recipe can touch. They stirred those golden, crunchy morsels straight into cornmeal batter with a little salt and water, sometimes a splash of buttermilk if the dairy had any to spare. Baked in a cast-iron skillet greased with lard, the bread came out with a crust that shattered when you broke it, and a richness inside that plain cornbread could never match. The cracklings released pork fat as they baked, creating pockets of flavor throughout the bread that made every bite different. A single pone of crackling bread could sustain a field worker through an entire afternoon. Modern cornbread recipes leave out the cracklings entirely, replacing them with sugar and butter. The result is cake pretending to be bread. Crackling bread was the real thing, born from necessity and perfected by women who understood that wasting even a scrap of pigskin was not an option. Number 24, pot liquor. After hours of simmering collard greens, turnip greens, or mustard greens with a smoked ham hock or a chunk of fatback, the liquid left in the pot was never discarded. That murky, dark green broth, called pot liquor, was a meal in itself. Enslaved cooks knew what nutritionists would not prove for another 2 centuries. That broth contained concentrated vitamins, minerals, and collagen extracted from the bones and greens during the long cook. Field workers drank it from cups or soaked it up with cornbread, getting nourishment that the greens alone could not provide. During the Great Depression, pot liquor became the subject of a national debate when a Georgia governor publicly argued over whether cornbread should be crumbled into the broth or dunked. But the recipe itself went back generations before that, to plantation kitchens where nothing could be wasted and every drop of nutrition mattered. Today, restaurants charge $15 for bone broth. Enslaved cooks were making it 300 years ago and calling it supper. Number 23, hoe cakes. The name tells you everything. Cornmeal batter cooked on the flat blade of a garden hoe held over an open flame. Enslaved field workers carried cornmeal in their pockets and mixed it with water at the edge of the field during the brief moments they were allowed to rest. The hoe blade, already hot from the sun and the fire, became a griddle. The result was a flat, crispy corn cake that could be eaten with one hand while walking back to work. George Washington reportedly loved hoe cakes so much he ate them drenched in butter and honey at breakfast. But the women who invented them ate theirs plain, standing in a tobacco field with no butter and no table. Over time, hoe cakes moved from the field to the kitchen, made in cast iron with eggs and milk added to the batter. But the original version, just cornmeal, water, and salt cooked on iron, was the foundation. Number 22, chitlins. Slaveholders kept the hams, the loins, the chops. What they threw to the enslaved were the intestines, the organs, the parts considered waste. From that waste, enslaved cooks created chitlins, a dish so labor-intensive it became a ritual. Cleaning pig intestines took hours. Cooks soaked them in salt water, scraped them and rinsed them again and again until the smell mellowed and the casings turned pale and tender. Then they were boiled or fried until they became something entirely new, chewy, rich, and deeply savory. The smell during cooking divided families then and divides them now. But for the people who created this dish, it was survival turned into celebration. Chitlins became the centerpiece of holiday meals across the Black South, especially on Christmas and New Year's. The tradition of the chitlin circuit, a network of performance venues for black entertainers during segregation, took its name from this dish. That is how deep chitlins run in American culture. A food born from the worst kind of rejection became a symbol of community. Number 21. Sweet potato. Pone. Enslaved cooks grated raw sweet potatoes by hand, mixed them with molasses or sorghum syrup, a little ginger, and whatever fat was available, then baked the mixture slowly until it turned dense, dark, and almost candy-like. No eggs, no flour, just the natural starch and sugar of the sweet potato binding everything together. The result was something between a pudding and a cake, served warm or cold, that could last for days without spoiling. Sweet potatoes grew easily in southern soil, and enslaved people were sometimes permitted garden plots where they cultivated them for their own use. The pone became a celebration food, appearing at gatherings and holidays when something sweet was needed and refined sugar was nowhere to be found. Sweet potato pie eventually evolved from this older, simpler recipe. But the pone came first, denser, earthier, and more honest about where it came from. Number 20. Pepper vinegar. Here is the condiment that changed everything. Enslaved cooks dropped hot peppers into jars of vinegar and let them steep for weeks. The result was a fiery, tangy sauce that could transform the blandest pot of greens or the toughest piece of meat into something worth eating. When your weekly ration was 5 pounds of cornmeal and a few pounds of salt pork, flavor was everything, and pepper vinegar delivered it. The combination of capsaicin and acetic acid did more than add heat. It helped break down tough fibers in meat, and it enhanced the perception of richness in simple dishes. Every barbecue sauce in the Carolinas traces its ancestry back to this basic combination of vinegar and pepper. An entire regional cuisine was built on a condiment invented by people who had almost nothing to work with. Number 19. Oxtail stew. The tail of the cow was considered butcher's waste, tossed aside for anyone willing to take it. Enslaved cooks took it. They braised those bony segments for hours with onions, garlic, and whatever root vegetables they could find, and the connective tissue slowly melted into the most luxurious gravy imaginable. The natural gelatin from the bones turned the broth silky and rich, clinging to every spoonful. One oxtail could feed a family because the long cook extracted every possible calorie from the bone and marrow. Today, oxtail sells for $12 to $15 a pound at the butcher. Restaurants serve it on white tablecloths as a delicacy. But for generations, it was the throwaway cut that enslaved cooks turned into something a king would envy. Number 18. One-pot cooking. First, a pattern break. Here is where the story shifts. That cast iron pot, sitting over a fire in the plantation kitchen, was not just a cooking vessel, it was a laboratory. Enslaved cooks developed one-pot cooking techniques out of necessity. They had one pot, one fire, and whatever ingredients they could find. But that limitation forced innovation. They slow-layered flavors, building a base with smoked pork, adding greens, dropping in whatever vegetables were available, and then letting time do the work. This became the foundation of Southern cooking itself. French chefs call it braising. Italian grandmothers call it slow cooking. But enslaved black women in Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina were doing it first. The method was African in origin, rooted in West African one-pot stews called palava sauce and groundnut soups. They carried the technique across the Atlantic in their memory because it was the one thing that could not be taken from them. Number 17, red beans and rice. Every Monday in New Orleans, enslaved cooks put a pot of red beans on the fire because Monday was wash day, and the beans could simmer unattended while the grueling work of washing and wringing laundry by hand consumed every hour. A ham bone left from Sunday dinner went into the pot first, then kidney beans, onion, celery, and bell pepper, the holy trinity of Creole cooking. Hours later, the beans turned creamy and thick, collapsing into a gravy that coated every grain of rice. This dish fed more people per penny than almost anything else on this list. It became so identified with New Orleans that Louis Armstrong used to sign his letters red beans and ricely yours. The recipe traveled from the plantation kitchen to every neighborhood in the city, crossing racial and economic lines because it was simply too good and too cheap to ignore. Number 16, cornbread, dressing, Southern Thanksgiving staple. When Thanksgiving came, enslaved cooks created something from cornbread that rivaled any European stuffing. They crumbled day-old cornbread, mixed it with sautéed onions, celery, and sage, moistened it with broth from whatever bird was being roasted, and baked it in a cast-iron skillet until the top turned golden and the inside stayed moist and savory. Unlike wheat bread stuffing, cornbread dressing had a crumbly, almost sandy texture that absorbed gravy like nothing else. The cornbread itself was a product of necessity, since wheat flour was expensive and reserved for the main house. Cornmeal was what enslaved cooks had, and from it they built a side dish that now anchors Thanksgiving tables across the entire South. Families fight over cornbread dressing the way other families fight over the turkey. The recipe passed from mother to daughter, generation after generation, and every family swears theirs is the original. Number 15, pig feet. Here is where science proves what enslaved cooks already knew. Pig feet simmered for hours until the skin turns gelatinous and the meat falls from the bone contain more collagen per serving than any supplement on the market today. Slaveholders gave the feet to the enslaved because they were considered garbage. But those women braised them in vinegar, onions, and red pepper flakes until they became tender, tangy, and rich. The collagen in the cooking liquid was a natural remedy for joint pain and skin health, benefits that modern wellness companies now bottle and sell for $40. Pickled pig feet became a staple at juke joints and barbershops across the South, served cold straight from the jar with hot sauce and saltine crackers. A food born from being given nothing but bones and skin became comfort food for an entire culture. Number 14, fried catfish. Rivers and creeks ran through or near most plantations, and enslaved people who were permitted to fish on Sundays supplemented their rations with catfish, a bottom feeder that was plentiful and easy to catch. They rolled the fillets in seasoned cornmeal and fried them in rendered lard in a cast-iron skillet until the crust turned golden and shattered at the first bite. The cornmeal coating was the genius. It created a barrier that sealed in moisture while developing a crunch that flour alone could never achieve. Catfish fries became communal events in black communities after emancipation, with entire towns gathering along riverbanks on Friday evenings to fry fish and share stories. That tradition survives today across Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, where catfish houses still serve it the same way. Cornmeal crusted, cast iron fried, no apology necessary. Number 13, ham hock and black-eyed peas. On New Year's Day, across the South, you will find a pot of black-eyed peas simmered with ham hock on nearly every stove. The tradition traces back to enslaved cooks who were given the bony, fatty hock of the pig, the cut that sits just above the foot. They simmered it with dried field peas for hours until the smoky pork flavor saturated every bean and the cooking liquid turned into a thick, savory broth called liquor. The dish was filling, cheap, and packed with protein. Black-eyed peas were one of the crops enslaved people grew in their garden plots, having carried the seeds from West Africa, where cowpeas had been cultivated for thousands of years. The New Year's tradition of eating them for good luck began in enslaved communities and spread to every table in the South, regardless of race. Today, the Hoppin' John variation, which adds rice, remains one of America's most enduring New Year's rituals. Number 12. The Erased Cookbook. Second pattern break. Controversy incoming. Here is what the history books do not tell you. The most famous cookbook in early American history was The Virginia Housewife, published in 1824 by Mary Randolph. It contained recipes for gumbo, okra soup, catfish, field peas, and dozens of other dishes that were standard in enslaved kitchens. Randolph was a slaveholder. The cooks in her kitchen were enslaved black women whose names never appeared in the book. This happened again and again across the South. White women published cookbooks filled with recipes developed by the enslaved cooks who worked in their kitchens. The knowledge was taken and the credit was erased. When Melinda Russell, a free black woman, self-published a domestic cookbook in 1866, it became the first known cookbook by an African American. But by then, the recipes had already been claimed by others. The entire foundation of Southern cooking was built by black hands, and the cookbooks that recorded it were written by white ones. That erasure lasted centuries. We are only now beginning to correct it. Number 11. Smothered pork chops. When cheap pork chops landed in the kitchen, tough and thin and nothing special, enslaved cooks transformed them through a technique that became an art form. Seasoned with salt, pepper, and garlic, dredged in flour and browned in a hot skillet, the chops were then buried under a mountain of sliced onions and covered with a lid. Low heat, long time. The onions collapsed into a sweet, savory gravy that braised the meat until it turned fork tender. The flour coating dissolved into the onion liquid, thickening it naturally into a sauce that clung to every bite. This was not a recipe that required expensive ingredients. It required patience and an understanding of how heat and time could turn something ordinary into something extraordinary. Smothered pork chops remain one of the most requested dishes at soul food restaurants from Atlanta to Chicago, virtually unchanged from the version created in plantation kitchens 200 years ago. Number 10. Gumbo. No dish on this list better illustrates the fusion of African, French, Spanish, and Native American traditions than gumbo. Enslaved cooks in Louisiana created it, drawing on West African okra stews, French roux technique, Native American file powder from sassafras leaves, and whatever protein the bayou could provide. The name itself comes from the Bantu word for okra, gumbo. A proper gumbo started with a dark roux, flour and fat, cooked slowly until it turned the color of chocolate. then was built with the holy trinity of onion, celery, and bell pepper. Shrimp, crab, sausage, chicken, whatever was available went in next. The okra or file thickened it. The whole thing simmered until every flavor merged into something that tasted like the entire Gulf Coast in a single bowl. Gumbo became the official state cuisine of Louisiana. It feeds thousands at festivals every year, and every single bowl traces back to the enslaved cooks who first stirred okra into a pot and created something entirely new on American soil. Number 9. Collard greens. The long, simmered greens cooked with smoked pork that anchor every soul food plate are a direct descendant of West African cooking traditions. Enslaved people recognized collards as similar to the leafy greens they cooked in stews back in West Africa. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal had centuries-old traditions of boiling greens with smoked or dried meat, and enslaved cooks adapted those methods with the ingredients available in the American South. A ham hock or a piece of fatback went into the pot first. Then the greens, washed and stripped from their stems, were piled high and pressed down as they wilted. Hours of simmering turned tough leaves into silky, smoky, deeply flavored greens. The pot liquor at the bottom was soaked up with cornbread. Nutritionally, collard greens are dense with vitamins A, C, and K, calcium, and fiber. Enslaved cooks did not know the science. They knew the greens kept people strong. Number 8. Red rice. In the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, enslaved Gullah Geechee people created red rice, a dish that connected them directly to their West African homeland. The recipe echoes jollof rice, one of the most iconic dishes across West Africa, where rice is cooked in a tomato-based sauce until every grain turns red and absorbs the flavor. Enslaved cooks adapted the technique using the tomatoes, onions, and smoked pork available on the plantation, cooking the rice slowly in a covered pot until it turned a deep, burnished red. A single pot of red rice could feed a dozen people. The skill of rice cultivation that made planters wealthy was African knowledge, brought across the Atlantic by the very people who were enslaved to grow it. Red rice was both survival and an act of cultural memory. Number 7. Peach cobbler. When peach season flooded the South with fruit too ripe to sell and too plentiful to eat fresh, enslaved cooks created cobbler. They poured sweetened, spiced peach into a baking dish, topped it with a simple batter of flour, sugar, butter, and milk, and let the oven do the rest. As it baked, the batter rose up around the fruit, creating a golden crust that was part cake, part biscuit, with pockets of bubbling peach syrup breaking through. No rolling pin, no lattice crust, no fuss. This was dessert built for kitchens where time and ingredients were scarce, but creativity was limitless. One bowl, one dish. 15 minutes of work and an hour in the oven produced a dessert that silenced the entire table. Number 6. Fried chicken. The dish that America claims as its own was perfected by enslaved cooks who combined West African deep frying traditions with Scottish seasonings brought by settlers. West Africans had been frying chicken in palm oil for centuries before the slave trade. In America, enslaved cooks seasoned the bird with salt, pepper, and whatever spices were on hand, dredged it in seasoned flour, and fried it in cast-iron skillets filled with lard. The technique of soaking the chicken in buttermilk before coating it, which tenderizes the meat and helps the crust adhere, was an enslaved cook's innovation. After emancipation, fried chicken became one of the first entrepreneurial foods for Black Americans. Women sold it at train stations and through windows to travelers because it kept well without refrigeration. Today, fried chicken is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The women who perfected it never saw a dime. Number 5. The Great Migration Kitchen, third pattern break. And here is the part that should make you pause. After emancipation, formerly enslaved cooks became the backbone of American food service. They opened restaurants, catered for wealthy families, sold plates from carts and windows, and carried their recipes north during the Great Migration. Millions of black families relocated from the rural South to cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York between 1910 and 1970, and they brought soul food with them. Restaurants opened on every block. The recipes did not change. What changed was the audience. And the word soul, borrowed from the music that was shaking the nation, was attached to the cuisine. Soul food was not a marketing term. It was a declaration. This food has a soul. It has a history, and that history is ours. Number 4. Cornbread. Not the sweet, cakey version sold in restaurants today. The real cornbread, the original, had no sugar, no wheat flour, and no apology. Just stone-ground cornmeal, salt, water or buttermilk, and lard, baked in a screaming hot cast-iron skillet until the bottom formed a crust that crackled when you broke it. Enslaved cooks made cornbread daily because cornmeal was the foundation of their rations. They did not add sugar because they had none, and the result was better for it. A savory, dense, golden bread made to be split open, filled with greens, soaked in pot liquor, or crumbled into a glass of buttermilk for a quick meal. The hot skillet technique, preheating the greased iron until it smoked before pouring in the batter, created that signature crust. This was African cooking knowledge meeting American ingredients. Cornmeal replaced the millet and sorghum of West Africa, but the technique of cooking grain on hot iron was ancient. Banana pudding, layered vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and a rich custard made from eggs, sugar, and milk, topped with a cloud of meringue and baked until golden. It emerged from black kitchens in the late 1800s as bananas became affordable in the American South. Formerly enslaved cooks and their descendants adapted English trifle techniques, replacing the sponge cake with vanilla wafers and the berries with bananas, creating something entirely new. The custard was cooked on the stovetop until it thickened and coated the back of a spoon, then layered warm over the wafers so they softened into a cake-like texture. Every church supper, every family reunion, every funeral reception in the South features banana pudding. It became the dessert of communal gatherings, always made in a large dish because it was never meant for one. Number 2. Jambalaya. Born in the kitchens of enslaved cooks in Louisiana, jambalaya married West African rice traditions with Spanish paella influences and French seasoning techniques. Enslaved cooks layered smoked sausage, chicken, shrimp, or whatever protein was available into a pot with onions, peppers, celery, tomatoes, and rice, cooking everything together until the rice absorbed every drop of seasoned liquid. The dish could stretch to feed 20 people from a single pot. There are 2 styles: Creole jambalaya with tomatoes born in New Orleans and Cajun jambalaya without tomatoes from the country parishes. Both trace their roots to the one-pot rice dishes of West Africa, adapted by enslaved cooks who carried the knowledge across the ocean. Jambalaya is now served at every festival, tailgate, and family gathering in Louisiana and beyond. Number 1. Macaroni and cheese. James Hemings was born into slavery in 1765, the property of Thomas Jefferson by age 8. At 19, Jefferson took him to Paris as an investment. He wanted a French-trained chef. Hemings trained under pastry chefs and the personal cook of a French prince. He mastered crème brûlée, meringues, and the dish that would define American comfort food forever: a baked pasta layered with cheese that he called macaroni pie. Back in America, Hemmings served it at state dinners. The recipe dazzled guests. Jefferson got the compliments. Hemmings remained enslaved. He negotiated for his freedom, but Jefferson required 3 more years of training a replacement before signing the papers. Hemmings walked free in 1796. 5 years later, he was dead at 36. The dish he brought to America became Kraft's best seller. It became the thing every child in this country asks for by name. And for 200 years, almost nobody knew who made it famous. That is the history of soul food. Genius created under the worst conditions human beings have ever imposed on each other. Try one of these this week. Make the cornbread without sugar. Simmer the collards for 3 hours. And when someone asks where the recipe came from, tell them the truth.